Hi everyone, I'm Timothy Von Reuden, better known as Von Art Online, and I am an independent artist based out of Wisconsin. And today I'm going to share some tips and tricks about contrast. So in art, contrast can be defined by many things. It can be hue, saturation, level of detail, how focused it is. But for today's tip tutorial, I'm going to talk more about low and high contrast in terms of value and definition. So this is a great example of a subject matter in low contrast and a subject in high. And you can see how the left one has a bit more of a blur feeling to it, and there's no really point of heavy contrast anywhere. And the right side has very heavy contrast. It's outlined by very dark subject matter on a very blatantly white background. And that stark difference has more of an impact than the one on the left. That's not to say that high contrast is necessarily better than low contrast. It just has more of a drawing, attention seeking nature to it. So I actually prefer having about 70 to 80% of my drawings with low contrast, and in the areas where I really want the area of focus to be of high contrast, so that remaining like 30 to 20% push the high contrast, and that will draw the viewer's eye into those areas. And by definition, the reason that this is considered high contrast is because you have these really dark values pushed up against light values, where the example on the left is a lot of mid-tone values with very little differentiating values to kind of distinguish what is what. And like I said, that doesn't mean it's worse, it just means that this has less of a contrast where this has more of a contrast. This drawing I did represented the idea of contrast in a more literal sense, where everything that was dark on one side would be light on the other. And you can see how I heavily played with value contrast to make that difference even more apparent. So in the inside of the ears are black, and then on the right side they're white. Now going a bit deeper, contrast could mean something more in subject matter, where this boy could represent peace while he's waving the white flag, and this boy could represent violence with the bat. So there's more to contrast than just visual language, but for now, let's just stick to values. So in this example, we essentially have three values working together. We have these very dark values representing the body, we have the mid-tone value of the background, and then we have essentially an absence of value wherever I kept it white on these areas here. And when you surround an area of zero value or of low value next to this very heavy dark value, it almost makes it look like it's emitting light. So you can create the illusion of light and glow from having this contrast being pushed right up to each other. And contrast can also help distinguish the separation between forms. So his fingers, you can see how I use the darker value on the tip of the finger, and then it kind of gradations into a lighter value. But because it's darker against the fingers and hand behind it, it stands out. And then here we almost have the opposite effect, where her clothes and the background and the halo are a very light value, almost a negative value, and then her skin tone really makes her pop out because of the contrast. So this is a really easy way to make subject matters either push forward or drop back, depending on the level of contrast that you're giving them. And a lot of that is dependent on the area and subject matter around them. So to help illustrate what I'm talking about, let me show you an example before I finish a drawing, where it starts out primarily as just a line drawing. So here you can see how there are lines separating the different forms, and we have this hatchling and the egg behind it, but you wouldn't be able to tell what is what right from the first look. You kind of have to look around to figure out from context clues what is what. And immediately when I see something like this, I want to start filling it in. So you can see how if I start adding some value from a very just light general shading technique, you can see how all of a sudden that dragon's arm and neck starts to add some form and separate from the background and from the egg that it's kind of climbing out of here. So I could do the same for the wing. And from here, I would obviously add a bit more detail and attention to refinement. But as a base, you can start to see how it becomes way easier to define what is what just from a little bit of that contrast. Now to add another level of the contrast from the dragon, the egg, and the background, I'm also going to do a very light pass on the background. It's going to be lighter than the dragon itself, but it's going to make the egg look extremely bright, and the egg will have its own value, essentially, that it can cling on to, where the background now is a different value altogether as well. So then, since I'm making the background darker, instinctually, I want to make the wing darker. So you can really start to see how forms will either come forward or recede depending on how you shade them and the level of contrast that you're giving them. So let me go ahead and finish this up and show you what it looks like in the end. So here's our dragon, and you can see the different levels of contrast just based on the amount of value and shading I gave each. And contrast is something that can be played in many different forms in a drawing, but if you're working primarily with pencils, it definitely relies heavily on value contrast. And it's something that once you start to understand visual tricks and ways to make the viewer look in certain directions based on essentially the values and contrast you're adding, it becomes really fun to add them and to kind of direct this narrative that you're creating. So for instance, this dragon, I wanted the attention to be near his head. So I kept the eye very light, but then the area around it I kept to be the darkest in the entire drawing. And that way it draws the viewer's eye up, and then it kind of stays here. And even if the eye lingers away, eventually it'll make its way back. And that's why I love playing with contrast. So I hope you learned something from this talk, and I definitely implore you to try contrast in all your works, especially if you're working traditionally.